Okay, so my name is Renata Whitty and I'm with New Mexico PTA, and we received a grant from National PTA, and that's National Parent Teacher Association, to conduct trainings at schools with families and administrators and instructors on how to read the PARCC assessments. There's a lot of different places that you can go. The PED website, which really sends you back to the PARCC website. Be a Learning Hero is another website, and there's been a lot written on blogs. Education Week, for instance, had something. The Albuquerque Journal recently published an article on how to read your student score assessments. But we felt that the one-on-one kind of communication with families at schools was really going to be more productive, and families could then really talk about questions that they had. So what we're really doing during this program is focusing on the assessment and how to read the assessments. There's a lot of topics and conversation about the assessment itself, but the fact is our students took the assessments back in April. We're starting to get the test results now, and that's where we really want to focus on how to read the assessments, because families are getting this information and they have not gone through any type of training on how to actually read and understand how they can help their student. That's a really important piece of this. You can get a test score, but that doesn't mean that you know how to help your student in order to improve on that test score for next year. So Tammy Baker is here with me today, and Tammy's the secretary of New Mexico PTA. And between Tammy and Belinda, I think we got all of the technology pieces worked out. So there's a couple of videos that we'll be showing you, and what I wanted to do was go through some of the material that you received when you signed in. This pack, and I'm not going to like read every page. So this is for you to read. This packet of information is available on the National PTA website, so anybody can go there and download. There are several components of the packet are available in Spanish. Okay, so first of all, I want to make sure that everybody that we're all starting at the same place. So in spring of 2015, students were tested using the PARCC test instead of the SBA test. The SBA, the last year of that testing, was in the spring of 2014. And the reason that states switched to the PARCC assessment, there are 11 states and the District of Columbia that are taking the PARCC assessment, and there are 15 states that are taking the assessment called Smarter Balanced. And they're basically the same type of assessments. They're all both based on Common Core. But there's a difference in the way that the test questions are phrased and the way that they're administered. And so states had an opportunity to choose, or they could develop their own type of assessment testing based on the Common Core. Common Core was adopted in 2011, and the purpose of Common Core is that a student can move from New Mexico to Michigan, enter fourth grade, middle of the school year, and find themselves in the same space as they were in New Mexico. If we are all teaching the same curriculum at the same progression, then a student can actually move around, whether it's within their home state or within the country, and enter in at the same grade and knowledge level. One of the issues that students had is as they were moving around the country, they may have been an A or B student in their home state, but when they moved to a different state, they could actually be higher or be lower, struggling, because the school was at a different space than they were. So that was the real intent behind Common Core. So now the question was, if everybody is going to be teaching Common Core, how do we go about and make sure that we can assess students and show, comparatively speaking, how students are doing state to state? And that's why the PARCC and the Smarter Balanced assessments were developed. So if we look at the Parent's Guide to Assessments in New Mexico, and we look at the first page, the second paragraph says that the new standards emphasize fewer topics and stress not only procedural skills, but also conceptual and critical thinking. So we're really moving away from the bubble test, which I would answer true or false, yes or no, choose options 1 through 5, and a student could really guess and maybe guess correctly. But in critical thinking skills, we're actually giving them a scenario and they're having to show their work. And that is a change for students. So if you're hearing that across the country or here in New Mexico, families are saying that students' test scores will be lower the first year, the states that have received their test scores have found that kind of across the board that's the case, and it's because students are learning how to take a test in a different manner than they have before. In the past, they've had to fill in the black bubble, and that was yes. And now they're actually having to show their work how they're responding yes. And so there's questions about keyboarding skills. There's questions about the amount of time that students need in order to take the test. And these are all things that were 240 educators came together from across the country of the states that were taking the PARCC test. And there were educators from New Mexico that were included in that consortium. And they talked about how students were going to be handling this and how much time they needed. So that's the biggest difference in the test. It's not a bubble test, it's actually critical thinking and showing their work. So if we turn to the next page, the second question is, what is different about the new assessments? The PARCC assessment enables educators to deepen their understanding of student progress from grade to grade, and just as importantly, identify any gaps in progress so they can address them well before students enter college or the workforce. So when we go through the slideshow, and we're going to show some of the different test examples, and then we actually look at the sheet that parents are receiving at home, you're going to see where educators and their families can take a look and see what areas students are struggling with and what areas students are really performing well and where we might be able to help them. And finally, there are also some sample questions on the back side of the second page, so you can get an idea of what kind of questions are students are being and how they're being tested. The second grouping of documents that you'll see is actually from Scholastic, because we want to make sure that you're getting a broad and clear, objective viewpoint. Obviously, PARCC is going to promote their test as the best thing ever because that's their job. They develop the test, right? But we want to make sure that you're also receiving information from different sources to have a balanced perspective on what the test is. And that's why one of the videos is from Being a Learning Hero. So if we look at the family guide to your state's annual test, if you go onto the second page, there are some questions. How are the new tests different? They are taken on a computer. They're separated into sections. They allow students to show their work. So again, when you have some time, you can go through these and read them. And if we continue through this particular document, on the very last page of the Scholastic section, you'll see there's been a big question about why it's taking so long for the test results to come back. And this is the first year that the PARCC assessment and the Smarter Balanced assessment has been given across the country. And so the tests are not only being graded through a computer grading, but also graded by hand as students are having to show their work. So obviously the first year, working out kinks, taking a little longer, but the anticipated result for the 2016 test scores will be that families will have the test scores at the beginning of the school year in fall of 2016. That way any adjustments that students need to make can be made at that time rather than what is really happening this year midway through the school year. All right. The third document that you have is College and Career Ready Standards, and this is really for our older students because we want to make sure the test scores the students are taking the tests in grades 3 through 11. So we want to make sure that as our older students are taking those tests that we have some developed test scores. And these were developed National PTA and the Learning First Alliance. So there's 5 different pillars. And again, that's for our older students because we wanted to make sure we had materials for our variety of ages of families. So let's go ahead and go through the PowerPoint now. Okay, so overview of what we're going to be discussing, what the new state test means for your child, what was your child tested on last year, accessibility for students with special considerations, how to understand and interpret the results, and then additional resources for parents. And I think the probably the one that is most important for this particular conversation today is the accessibility for students with special considerations. There are some regulations that go around that. And because the tests are given on the computer, although they can be given on paper, there are accommodations that are available for students that weren't available in the past. But the timing of requesting those accommodations is really important. Alrighty, so we've got a couple of different videos. The first video is the PARCC video, and it was developed by the PARCC Consortium. And it's going to kind of give you an overview of how PARCC is different from the SBA testing that was done.
When it comes to our students' education, we all want to know the most important thing. How are they doing in school? What can they improve on? Will they be ready for college, for their careers? Will they be ready for life in the real world?
Well, that's what we're trying to figure out.
That's Leanne Marcus, a 4th and 5th grade teacher in New Jersey.
As you may know, many states across the country have recently adopted more and more rigorous standards in math and English language arts. This is to ensure our students graduate high school equipped to succeed in college and their careers.
So, basically, we're raising the bar for our students, which means that we need to find innovative new ways to measure their progress in learning. And that's to answer the question, how are they doing? That's why many states work together to develop a new assessment system called PARCC, which stands for the Partnership for Assessment of Readiness for College and Careers.
Designed by educators and aligned to the rigorous state standards, PARCC not only measures student learning, but also important skills like critical thinking and problem solving, the skills students will need to succeed in the real world.
In short, PARCC is a complete assessment system, and it was created with teachers for students. Students will take the test toward the end of the school year, and most should be able to complete it within a week or 2, depending on school schedules. Eventually, PARCC will measure student progress during the school year. These new assessments will replace old state tests. To illustrate what PARCC is, let's focus on a few of its most innovative features and see how it will provide better information for teachers and parents. First, PARCC tests can be done entirely on the computer. An online-based system makes the testing process more engaging for students and more efficient for educators to collect results. It even allows options for students with special needs.
But if your school isn't cut equipped for the online test, a pencil and paper version of PARCC will be made available.
In the English language arts section, students read fiction and non-fiction passages from real texts, as well as watch videos or listen to audio. They must study this media carefully and use it to give written responses with supporting evidence. In the mathematics section, students solve multi-step problems that require mathematical reasoning and show their understanding of each problem. They must also create equations based on real-world problems.
PARCC provides a clear picture for teachers, students, and parents about whether a student is prepared for each step in their education. Soon, PARCC results will be available within the same school year that tests are taken. This means that teachers will be able to help students get and stay on track.
Perhaps the best part of PARCC is that its assessments give teachers actual data to work with. This will enable teachers to identify areas of improvement in their students and to ensure they are prepared for the following school year. And for the first time, PARCC will allow students to have comparable results across multiple states.
What makes this so exciting is that it gives us a big picture look at our education system. where students are struggling and learning suffering.
When students succeed in the classroom, they're more likely to succeed in life and positively contribute to the communities where they live and learn. Learn more by visiting parconline.org.
Okay, so again, that's the video that's produced by PARCC. And then the next one that we're going to be watching is Be a Learning Hero. And Be a Learning Hero is an independent organization. So,
They'll be a little less raw PARCC and informational.
English teacher at My name is Sarah Brown Westling. I'm a high school English teacher at Johnston High School in Johnston, Iowa. Getting up in the morning
and this was the one that worked.
My name is Sarah Brown Westling.
Okay. Should we just leave it?
Let me see if I can.
There we go. That's her.
And going to school. My name is Sarah Brown Westling. I'm a high school English teacher at Johnston High School in Johnston, Iowa. Getting up in the morning and going to school never feels like a job to me. My students fuel me in the most amazing ways. I hope that they will be lifelong learners. I hope that they will be able to find their passions and go pursue them. The first thing I would say to parents as these new assessments are being rolled out is to take a deep breath. The idea that they will replace the assessments that have already been in place. We have new assessments because we have different standards. And the standards are promoting skills like critical thinking, problem solving, being able to reason and explain that reasoning. We need an assessment that really matches those standards. The easiest way to really see the differences in the assessment is to take a look at them online. We are going to take a look at the fifth grade math assessment from PARCC. Students have lots of tools available like a ruler, a calculator, or a notepad, which allows them to keep track of their thinking and their reasoning so they can explain it in the answer. Here, in order to demonstrate an understanding of fractions, the student must create his own comparison and explain why certain reasoning is incorrect. Here, students need to use a drag and drop feature and answer multiple parts to a question. So students have to understand more than just a single concept. When asked to find the volume of a cube, students are asked first to show the equation and formula they used, and then to type how they found their answer. So that's math. But what about English? Well, it's actually pretty similar. Let's take a look. Here, instead of just selecting a word to describe characters from the passage, students have to describe two characters and use a line from the text that supports their choice. In this question, students will have to read two passages about penguins and compare them. You'll notice the details contain concepts like point of view and present tense. In order to answer it correctly, they need to know some academic vocabulary. Using the same articles about penguins, students will now be asked to watch an additional video and write an essay. As you can probably guess, they'll be required to use information from the sources in their essay. This is where the highlighting tool comes in handy. What I really like about these assessments is, first of all, the way that they match the standards that we're already teaching. The second thing is the way they're asking questions differently. They're asking students to demonstrate their mathematical reasoning skills. They're prompting students to make compelling arguments. They are asking students to work with a diverse set of texts and synthesize those. These are all the skills we know students need in the real world. The results of these assessments can be used by parents and teachers alike to really figure out where students are at in their continuum of learning. So for some students, that means we might be able to decide they need a little bit more help. For other students, we may learn that they need to be pushed a little bit and they need to be challenged by going deeper into a subject matter. We need to be able to understand how students are continually working and struggling with these challenging skills. So we want students to take these assessments, not so that we can tell them that they're good or bad or they got it right or wrong. We want them to take these assessments so that it can inform instruction. If you have more questions, check out the website, bealearninghero.org, where you can get tips to help support your child, information on the assessment, practice assessment, and a lot of other great resources as well. Okay.
So you can see the tests look pretty different from what your child took the year before. And again, the purpose of that is really to have students show their work. So they're not just putting down an answer to guess, but they're actually demonstrating that they have an understanding of that concept. Let's go to the next slide. Thanks. Okay, so the statewide tests. I think it's really important here to remember, though, this test is a moment in time on that particular day. So just as we do things better on one day than another day, so we need to look at this for our students. It is a good indicator of how well the students understand concepts, but we need to put also a balance in there that they took a test at 11 o'clock in the morning and they had or may not have had a snack prior to that could make a difference in how they're doing their testing. So as you get these test results back and as you're looking at them, let's make sure that we kind of frame it with it's important to look at the results, but it's also important to look at the results from the entire year. Okay, so the PARCC tests are developed by a consortium of teachers. As we said before, 240 teachers came together. There were teachers from New Mexico. And one of the things that's really important is there have already been changes made to the PARCC test for spring of 2016. One of them, for instance, is the testing window will be reduced from 2 testing windows down to 1 testing window. And for New Mexico, those dates are in April. Last year they were testing in March and in April. This year it's going to be just in April. The number of hours that the students spent has been reduced by 90 minutes. So we've reduced both the English language arts and the math component. So I think that's important to know that when people came back with information or with concerns, that the PARCC Consortium listened to that and started to make adjustments. And I imagine that there will be more as we go through this process. Every time we change a testing component, people have mixed reactions to it, and it takes a while to get through the process. When we move to the SBAs, the same kind of process happens. So this is not new or unusual. All right, so what are the new tests trying to accomplish? We're trying to end teaching to the test. And I know that we're hearing a lot of information that teachers are teaching so that students can do well. But when you look at those tests where they're actually having to show their work and to show concepts, they need to really have that understanding. I can't teach you something that you can then turn around and write exactly what I said. In reading this information, you really have to understand what you're reading and what you're writing about. Real world skills, I think that's really important. I saw a very cool concept where the teacher had his 5th graders actually become architects, and they were working on math in order to build an extension onto their school building, and what would that look like, and then using a lot of different concepts, not only in architecture but in how are they going to advertise this, so they were using their English language arts. So that's a real world concept. You know, that Joey had 7 peaches and Annie had 5 pears, you know, not so much. We don't find that in our day-to-day life. Identify whether students are on the path to success. And as we get through and start reading and looking at the test scores, I think you'll have a chance to see exactly how you can look at those test scores and assess exactly where your students are. All right, so what's different about the tests? So extended writing and multi-step questions. So it's not just one concept, one question, second concept, second question. Because we are shortening the number of minutes spent on the test, there will be less test questions in April 2016, but the content is still going to be as well-rounded. And then, so now we're looking here on this slide, what were students tested on in English? So we're reading, writing effectively, listening effectively, and using research skills. And these are all skills that they will need in the workforce, whether they're going to go on to college or to some other sort of educational opportunity, or whether they're going straight in the workforce. These are skills that are necessary for students to succeed in today's world. So we have an example on this slide of a 5th grade English language arts. So I'll let you take a moment and read that. Any questions so far? All right, then let's go on to the math and see what students were tested on in math. So here we're talking about concepts and procedures, problem solving, creating models, and building practical arguments to support their reasoning. So when somebody says to you, so why do you think that 2 plus 2 equals 4? Now students will have to actually show that work and not just respond that 2 plus 2 equals 4, yes or no. And so let's look at an example on the math test. Alrighty. Accessibility for students with special considerations. So these items I think are very important, and we're going to break it down into features for all students, features that need to be identified in advance, students with disabilities, and accommodations for English learners. The very important concept here is that the accommodations need to be identified prior to testing day. So a parent cannot walk into school the morning of testing and saying, by the way, my student needs this special accommodation. And it's really important that they are identified previously in the IEP, and most importantly, that the student have an opportunity to work with that accommodation, to play around with it, so that on testing day they're comfortable using that particular accommodation. And again, there are some of the features that need to be identified in advance. I know that this year we had some challenges that accommodations would be loaded in on a computer for a student, and the student would go in and start the test and the accommodation wouldn't be there. And the instructor would have to close down the program, reload, and re-go through that. So that is something that they are working to make that a more seamless process for the 2016 testing cycle. And Cindy is going to be talking about specific accommodations when we're at the end of the PowerPoint. So please remember that question about color contrast, and we'll make sure we address that. So again, the accommodations need to be specified in the IEP, and the student should have time to use the accommodation before the testing cycle begins. And then there are also the final areas, the accommodations for English learners. All right, so let's talk about the test results and how to interpret those, because they look a lot different than what we used to get. If you go to understandthescore.org, that is one resource for you to be able to take a look at some of the information. But we're also going to go through, and each of you should have picked up a sheet that looks like this. That is a sample test. Okay. All right, Tammy, let's go to the next slide, please. All right. So one of the questions that we've had raised is, how am I going to be able to compare this year's PARCC test to last year's SBA test? My child is in 4th grade, and I want to be able to compare what they did in 3rd grade to what they did in 4th grade. And the answer to that is we can't do a comparison. We are truly comparing apples to oranges. They're two different types of tests, two different baseline scores. The students will be repeating the PARCC test in 2016, and so then we will be able to have a basis for comparison. So what we're really looking at this year is setting that baseline score and then making adjustments in the students' learning through the instructional coach or help at school, and then what we're doing with our students at home. So the question is on the accommodations for the English language learners, and do they have to be included in the IEP previously? And Cindy's going to respond to that and cover that in her presentation when we're done with these slides. So please don't forget that. Thank you for asking the question. All right, so let's take a look at the test. This breaks down the child's report. So we have a bar that's across in level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4, and level 5. And this is a 6th grade student. And you see that their score was 739. And in level 3, between 725 and 750, the student ended up right in the middle of level 3. In our old A, B, C, D, and F scores, we would think, well, so level 3 looks to us like a C. So that's okay, right? I'd like you to turn over the page, though. And in the center, it gives you descriptions of level 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So in level 3, you'll see that it's not that they've mastered the skill, but they're approaching expectations. And I think that's the really important piece for us to remember as we're looking at these tests. It's very easy to get that complacency with level 3. They're good. But what it actually means is they're getting there, but they don't have a full mastery of the concepts. Now, where they fall within level 3, obviously if they're going to be closer to that 750, then we have a better feeling like they've got a better understanding of the concept. If they're closer to 725, which is the cutoff for level 2, then we see that they're struggling more. All right, so I actually read an article recently about the teachers that came together in Denver that put together this rubric, the 650 to 850. And there was a lot of discussion to make sure that students were being graded fairly. And it was kind of an interesting article to read because these numbers weren't picked at random. They really, for the instructors that came together, felt like they would show a good representation of where that student landed as compared to their peers. So you'll see in the gray bar that's below the colored bar, there's a school average, a district average, the state average, and then the PARCC across the country average. So that gives you a really nice visual of where your student falls within all those different segments. The lower half of the sheet is then divided into reading and writing. So this is the language arts sheet. And you'll see that there's literacy text, informational text, and vocabulary. And there's blue arrows. The legend on the right side shows that if the arrow goes down, then they're below expectations. If the arrow is side to side, they nearly meet expectations. And if the arrow is up, they meet or exceed expectations. And then there's an informational paragraph about each of those three segments under literary text, and there are two under writing expression. So this would give a parent a really good idea of how their child is absorbing information that they're reading and or how they're able to then extract information and produce that literary text. The second sheet that you have is Algebra 2. And again, it goes through basically the same rubric, where they are in their test score, how they compare in the school district, state, and PARCC average, and then additional information about the mathematics score. And there's also information on the back side of the sheet specifically around the report. Okay, so let's talk about how those test results are going to be used. From a district standpoint, a district can look at, can use the data, well, the state can also, but we're really more concerned about this district and the school. From a district standpoint, the district can use the data to show what teaching practices might be working in one school versus another school, because if they've got basically the same population in two schools, why is one school very different than another school? From a school standpoint, the principal can look at it within the classroom to see if a teacher may need extra support or if the students may need extra support because of where they landed at the beginning of the school year. There also may be information about does that particular classroom need more challenging work? If the students are all at the top level, then they may need to move to something. So the real challenge in interpreting these results is we're getting them mid-year, and how do we help our students for the rest of the school year? And I know Cindy's going to address that in her conversation as well, tools for parents. So I think it's really important, again, to remember that this is a snapshot of time on a particular day, and that it needs to be one assessment tool as we're looking at how the student did the entire school year. Many of our districts do a assessment at the beginning of the school year. They're required to do a mid-year assessment, but districts are able to choose whatever assessment tool they would like to use. It's not the same across the state. And then they're all required to take some sort of an assessment testing at the end of the school year. There are families that have chosen to opt out of the test and not have their child take the test. And we actually had a very interesting discussion about this at one of the other trainings. In high school, students need to take the test in their 11th year so that they can assess their graduation requirements for year 12 and what other testing tools they may need to take in order to get their diploma or a certificate of completion. By opting a student out year after year, we're from a family perspective, that's a personal choice, but the students must take something in grade 11. So if they don't have that background of test taking, again, it's the family choice, but is the student going to be prepared? And that's something that needs to be looked at down the road when we're choosing the opt-out. The other information that families should know is that when 95% of students do not take the test, so we have more than 5% opting out, it actually lowers the grade of the school. So whereas the school may have been a B school in the 2014-15 school year, if more than 5% of their students opted out, their grade will drop one level. And this has unintended consequences, because a realtor now could say, yeah, they used to be a really great school, because the realtor, that's not their job to understand test scores, right? They used to be a really great school, but yeah, something happened, they got a new principal, and oh, look, they dropped a grade. You don't want to live in that neighborhood. Let me take you to a different neighborhood. So again, unintended consequences, but it's really difficult for our teachers when they work so hard to educate our students, and there are other situations that come into play that are beyond their control. So our teachers have done, I think, a great job in preparing our students for the test. I think everybody has learned something in the spring of 2015 to better prepare our students for the 2016 tests. But I will say probably the most telling comment that I heard from a third grader when asked, what did he think about the new test? And because he'd never taken a test before, so he didn't have a basis of comparison. His response back was, yeah, my teacher was really stressed out about it. It was no big deal. So let's be careful how we talk to our students as well, because for them, they're used to taking the SBA, and now they're taking the PARCC instead. A different type of test, but they're used to that testing cycle.
Is that information available of how many students opted out in a certain school or district?
The question is the information available as to how many students opted out in a school or a district? And you would go to the Public Education Department website to find that information, or you could talk to the school principal directly, because they do have that information. All right, so we have a couple resources. Again, Be a Learning Hero was the second video that we watched. And of course, PARCC.com. They're the inventors of the test. The test is administered through Pearson. Pearson has the capacity to administer tests on a large scale, but the consortium is through PARCC.
Are there samples for different grades?
Yes, there are. There are samples of the test for different grades on the PARCC website. So I'm going to turn the presentation over to Cindy, and she's going to talk, we had a couple of questions specifically about accommodations, so she's going to talk about that. And Cindy, I'm going to have you wear the headpiece so that we can continue recording this. Thank you, Cindy.
Oops, I forgot the pretty version.
Yeah, there we go.
Okay.
Introduce yourself.
Okay. So my name is Cindy LaFawn, and I'm a family liaison with Parents Reaching Out. I've been here for about 4 years, and we had a lot of calls and questions about the park. So we're going to go ahead and talk about some of the different things in terms of accessibility and accommodations. Okay, so as Renata touched upon, there are a lot of accessibility features in the park. They have some really great things in there. Gala, you had mentioned the color, background font color. So there are some accessibility features that are readily available to every student, as you saw in that video. Some of them have to actually be turned on in advance, so that's going to require that you do this work ahead of time with the team. Those ones include answer masking. So if a student basically is able to eliminate one answer, they can take that out, cover that over. The background and font color, again, you can switch it up. So it can be a dark background with light writing or vice versa. That can be particularly helpful for individuals with visual impairments or oftentimes dyslexia. That is sometimes a great accommodation for that. There's also a text-to-speech portion for math that can be used. But again, those have to be turned on in advance. So if they need to be turned on in advance, or really if the student needs any of those, they do need to be identified ahead of time through what's called the PNP, or the Personal Needs Profile. It was a new acronym for me, so I can add that to my book. But that is drawn up by educators. Parent input is not required, but definitely, you know, in our role, we certainly encourage that. Access to those accessibility features would be determined then by the IEP team or the 504 team. It is also, some of these features are recommended particularly for target populations, and those include English language learners, students with 504 plans, or students who might be receiving support through the RTI or SAT team process. So to go into a little bit more detail about the accommodations, there are three main areas that they look at with this. The first one is a presentation accommodation, which obviously changes how the information itself is presented. That could be that it's read aloud to a student. It could even be that a student reads something aloud to themselves so they can hear their information and work with it that way. Response accommodations obviously allow for a student to respond differently. And by that, with that, you could be looking at a variety of things. You could be looking at scribing. You could be looking at using a communication board. There's lots of different options for that. Typically, you see a lot of those built into IEPs anyway, so a lot of those things can transfer right in. And then the third area is with timing and scheduling accommodations. So it can change the amount of time a student is allowed to take the test. So we often see extended time on accommodations, or it can change the way the time is organized. So if you have a student that does really well in the morning, but all testing is scheduled for afternoon, it can be an accommodation through the IEP team or 504 team to change that time. You can also allow the student to take frequent breaks. It gets a little bit tricky because with the extended time, however, you only have one additional day to complete this testing. That is with PARCC rules. So that can get a little tricky with that. As Renata touched upon earlier, all of these things have to be documented in the IEP or 504 plan prior to testing. So the day before isn't going to get it done. The week before is probably not going to get it done either. We know that these things take a while. And so this advance notice requires that the IEP team or 504 team really communicates, documents everything, and has a really good planning process. So as parents, this is when you can really get involved with that, work with that IEP team or 504 team. Okay, so if your child needs some accommodations, there are some things you can do to really make sure that those are happening. Talk to the IEP team and start early. That would include the 504 team. Let's see, you also want to identify the testing windows for the district and the grade. So Renata just filled us in that those are in April. So we know we have a little bit of time to get this information to parents, but not a lot, because we also know that in reality, when trying to schedule an IEP meeting or anything like that, it can get delayed and delayed and delayed. Really important to be on top of it ahead of time. Definitely you want to express your concerns in writing and with timelines. So if you think your child is going to need some additional accommodations to really do well in the PARCC test or just really be able to get that information, definitely put that in writing, and with that you want to request an IEP or a 504 meeting. Now we're hearing from a lot of districts around the state that school districts are only saying one IEP meeting a year. Well, we know that's not really what the law says, but that is really what teams are trying to do in a lot of places. So it's going to be really important to, again, make sure that you're documenting that request, but also consider, do you actually need a full IEP meeting? If this is your only area of concern, this could probably be done with an addendum. So just weigh that out too. And again, make sure the accommodations are documented in the IEP or the 504 plan. So there are some other considerations, and Renata did touch a lot on some of these. One thing that comes up often in New Mexico is the child proficient with using a computer? Do they have regular access to that in their community? If not, what is that going to look like? Do you want to opt for the paper and pencil test? Do you want to get them some skills on the computer ahead of time? Does your child have test anxiety? That can really make a difference in the accommodations that you choose. A child with test anxiety might really do well from frequent breaks, a smaller group setting, those kinds of things. Something that often comes up, and this is a concern that we hear from teachers a lot, is some of those accessibility tools. And you saw in the video how they were moving things around. For some kids, that's going to be really distracting. It's going to be a lot of things to play with, and it might not actually help them to get to the test. So really look at those things too, and choose with your team carefully what's going to work for your child. The other thing you can do is, as Renata mentioned, allow them time to practice. Practice using those accommodations, practice taking a test. In some ways it's counterintuitive, but if we want our kids to do well on these tests, that's what they're going to need. So you might also want to consider whether the school or the district has a plan to provide scribes and those types of things. A lot of times districts don't have staffing, so you'll want to make sure you're communicating with the team about what is in fact in place. And then opting out. As Renata touched on, it is kind of a hot button thing. This part can be a political test, and parents do have the choice of opting their students out. In the lower grades, there's not the huge impact that there is in the high school grades. On the books right now, it does say that students should be passing or proficient in these standardized assessments in order to graduate. One of the things that is important to know, though, is that there is also on the books an alternative demonstration of competency, which allows for students who don't do well on these kinds of tests to use end of course exams or portfolio approaches. Okay, and that's it. Questions? Yes. Mm-hmm. And that is tricky because at that point, I'm sorry. So the question was about how English language learners without IEPs are able to access accommodations or modifications. Essentially, you would be looking at the accessibility features as opposed to the English or the accommodations and really using those. And again, that's going to be important to work with the teachers, to work with the teams. Each student is going to have an individual profile developed for them about their needs. And so there is that opportunity for input. Other questions? Mm-hmm.
If a parent decides to let their child take it in the 11th grade, because that's what they said that they have to, and they don't pass a portion of it, but they pass a different portion of it, or whatever, you're saying that will they receive a diploma, or will they just have like a completion of graduation?
I'm going to let Renata touch on that one.
I know that most states said that yes, that they will graduate, but I guess the most important thing that I've been getting a lot of personally, will they get a diploma?
So the question is around the graduation requirements, and if students opt out in 11th grade, what do they end up with in 12th grade? And if they choose to take the test but they don't do well on the test, how do they get that graduation diploma? So it's a great question. We've been addressing that a lot. And what I will say is that the Public Education Department, the New Mexico Public Education Department, on their website has one entire document that is devoted to exactly that question. And the types of tests that you need to take are really dependent on the year that you entered high school. So a student who entered high school in 2012 has different requirements than 2011, has different requirements than 2010. So that's number one, to go on the Public Education Department website and determine exactly where your student fits into that grandfathering. The second part of that answer is there are different types of tests and portfolios, as Cindy mentioned, that can be done for our high school students. There are also different levels. There's a graduation diploma, and there's a certificate of completion, which is something that is received from the high school. So there's also a GED that a student can take. So there are different ways to show that the student has completed high school. The certificate of completion does not hold as much weight as a regular high school diploma does. So that is a decision for the family to come together based on what their students' needs are and their students' abilities and frankly, the family's desires. And did you have a second question?
Also asking, parents are also asking about how many times that they have to take the test in order to pass. Like, I guess how many opportunities do they have? Because they because one thing that we have kind of heard is that if you pass a certain portion of the test, then you won't have to take that portion of it again. You'll just have to take the portion that you didn't.
So so the question is about how many times a student needs to repeat a test in order to get a passing grade. And we're referring specifically to high school students that were in their 11th year of school. Again, there are some definitions around that on the Public Education Department website, and it really is dependent on when that child entered high school. So I would recommend that the question be directed to the Public Education website, and that's where families can get the information that they need. And it's pretty easy to understand. You just have to find where your student entered, what year your student entered. Any other questions for today? Yes.
Can a parent then ask to opt for a paper and pencil test for their child versus the computer if they feel like they're not?
So the question is, can a parent ask their school to have a paper and pencil test rather than a computer test? And I believe in the accommodation list we saw that yes, the family can ask for that.
So my second question is if they opt for that paper and pencil test, do they have the same, not the same tools, but similar tools like a ruler that comes down? So will they get a piece of paper that has a line on it? Will they be able to have a writing pad? Will they have those same opportunities that a child uses?
So the question is, if a child chooses to use a paper and pencil test, will they have the same tools available to them as a child who is using the computer to take their test? And certainly with a paper and pencil, a ruler, and those kind of physical tools are available, but the masking, for instance, that's available on the computer would not be available to them.
But they would be able to give them like a ruler, a scratch pad.
There are,
those other types of tools.
yes, the tools that are necessary for a child to physically handle a ruler or a scratch pad would be available. Yes, another question.
Is there a plan for intervention procedure for those students who do not pass the test?
So the question is there a plan for intervention for students? And I assume we're referring to 11th grade students.
No, any students.
So, okay, so if a student performs in the 1 or 2 level on their assessment, is there a plan for intervention? And this is where the family involvement is really important. And Cindy was going to talk about some ways to engage families. So I'm going to let her handle this question.
Okay, So you had a couple different steps in that question. Definitely, when you're looking at if a student's test scores come back and they're not good, and as a parent, that answer of this is a transition year doesn't feel right to you, you want more intervention, that would be an appropriate time to talk to the school about either looking at additional interventions through the SAT team or maybe some tier 2 interventions. But it would also be possible, it might be possible that a lot of students have similar scores, and at that point, a lot of those things could be handled in the classroom with some differentiated instruction and some reteaching of different elements. So in terms of is there a plan, there's not an overall plan. It would be highly individualized based on, the population, the students, the class, the teacher, all of those pieces. But you could certainly find patterns and kind of hone in on those skill areas.
Are educators prepared to do these varieties of intervention?
Okay, so the question was, are educators prepared for the variety of interventions? And Gala, that's a tricky question because as we do this work, we run into educators who are very well prepared and we run into educators who are not. So it is, again, it's going to be very different teacher to teacher, community to community. I definitely think that teachers who need additional support could go to their district and ask for that because these are high stakes things. And we definitely know through talking with teachers as well that a lot of times they don't feel like they can really go and get that support and answers from administration. But we also know that the only way that's going to change is if we start pointing out that problem and asking for the help that we need. And that goes for teachers too.
So there isn't a plan for public education department for anything like that?
So the question was, yeah. So the question was, so there isn't a plan with the public education department for those interventions. And you're right, Gala. There is not a specific plan in place. Renata, are you aware of any other kinds of plans with regard to that? Or, okay, not at this time. So that's a great question, though.
That way they know what's coming on the test, and that way they can be better mentally prepared.
Mm-hmm. So the question was, in the case of, say, a student who doesn't read, are there preview questions or ways a student can prepare with that PARCC test? There are some of those available, Adam. In terms of the accommodation piece and the read aloud feature, I don't know how many of those are readily accessible through these pieces. Renata, do you know if those? Okay, I will let Renata touch on that.
That's a great question. And one of the reasons that we're giving out the PARCC website is for families to be able to go to the website and look at those preview questions. There have been a whole group of questions that have just been released because they were on last year's test, so now they can be the preview for next year's test. The accommodation for having someone read to a student who is a struggling reader is definitely something that a family can talk to their teacher about and make sure that it's part of their IEP or their 504 plan, wherever it best fits in. And to go back to the importance of families looking at these test results and taking a step forward, I think I want to go back to the question about, is there a plan to help teachers with this information? When you're looking at a particular student and you're looking at the school average, the district average, the state average, and the PARCC average, if your student is way below those averages, then I think that really points to, and if your classroom is even way below those averages, it points to the extra help needed for that teacher to work with those students, or now because we're in a second year, for those students to be identified that were really struggling. And that's where I think families can be a real advocate for their child. If they're concerned that their child is testing in a level 1 or level 2, and they really feel that they should at least be at a level 3 and certainly in a level 4, again, we need to look at that one test, that one moment of time, and how did they perform the rest of the school year. If they were always doing well the rest of the school year, then they just had a bad testing day. But it's not going to affect whether that child moves from 4th to 5th grade. So it's really having that conversation with the teacher. What does this mean for my child? And from the students that took the test last year in 4th grade, did all the 4th graders perform like this? Or do I need to ask for some special help from my student?
Is there like an expected, I guess, for future results for this upcoming test that's coming up in 2016, when those results are going to be able to be given out as an individual basis? And I'm more concerned with like those that are in 11th grade now that are going to be taking it now in April, that are going to be a senior next
So
year.
the question is, are the test results going to be distributed in a more timely fashion in 2016?
Concerning about, I guess, for college scholarship applications, graduation on the regular.
There has been a lot of concern with students getting their test scores back so they can make those college applications in time. And the goal, and I think they mentioned in the video, and the goal of PARCC is to release the test results at the beginning of the school year so that students will have time to make adjustments, and whether it's on the testing for the 11th grade students or simply the teaching for the other students. So I really want to thank you for your time. I'd like to thank Parents Reaching Out for hosting this event, and for Cindy for helping me with the presentation. This recording will be made available on the Parents Reaching Out website as well as the New Mexico PTA website. And thank you to Tammy Baker, who helped us set up the technology piece. Again, I appreciate your time and look forward to working with you in the future.